Good morning, and thank you for watching on March 13th, this Thursday morning. The potent trough that we've been talking about just about every day this week is on shore now in the western U.S. You can see that cloud shield moving through California, the rest of the Northwest. If we take a bigger view here of the Pacific and just look behind that, you can see another long wave trough out further into the Northwest Pacific, further to the south than that, a little short wave trough kind of extending to the south. These are going to merge over the coming days and will make up our next system that we'll have to talk about near the end of the weekend and ultimately next week. But the focus for this video here has to be this potent trough that we've kind of been waiting on and all the impacts. Now I'm going to break this video quickly into three parts, and it's really going to focus on the three hazards that this potent trough is going to bring us as it makes its way across the U.S. The first will be all the impacts to the western U.S. We can see just this morning on the all hazards map from NOAA, flood watches in Southern California, winter storm warnings further north than that over the Sierra Nevada, where we're expecting feet of snowfall. More so kind of ending today and tomorrow, although there'll be lingering showers and snow through the weekend. Even the Cascades are going to see an uptick in that activity. But in terms of the significant severe threat of the system, it will transition overnight tonight into Friday as what we'll call a wind and fire weather risk. And we can see those red flag warnings posted for the Central Plains here this morning as winds will pick up. High wind watches and warnings spreading kind of all around those, and then underneath the red flag warnings that you can see there, and those are posted in that beige color. Critical fire risk today from much of the portions of the high plains extending north into Nebraska, even South Dakota, again overlapping with those red flag warnings, which are valid as of this morning here on Thursday. That intensity of that fire weather and that wind threat will be peaking well overnight into Thursday and really Friday morning around sunrise. And that is where we see this critical and then extreme risk area from the Storm Prediction Center. And I can't overstate that. We're seeing the snow, the flooding concerns in the western U.S. There's burn scars, unfortunately, in Southern California from the recent wildfires, and we need to watch those closely here this morning. This threat on Friday morning with strong winds potentially exceeding 70-mile-an-hour gusts, dry conditions in this area, and this extreme fire risk, this could be the most significant weather threat from this event. We have the severe weather to talk about on Friday and Saturday. That could be equally significant. We'll get into the details of that in a moment. But I don't want to overstate or understate, I should say, this threat here, extending all the way from portions of the Texas Panhandle up into southern Kansas. Now, I just mentioned as we go through Friday afternoon and evening, Storm Prediction Center this morning releasing their day 2 outlook with a moderate chance for severe thunderstorms. That is high. It's really 4 out of 5 on their scale, which you can see here at the bottom. And then somewhat rare to see 2 back-to-back moderate or 4 out of 5 risk days. As we go to Saturday, we see this threat transition toward a more typical southeastern threat for this time of year in early March for portions of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, with an expansive enhanced risk area beyond that. We'll have to talk about this. Now, we're not done there. As we get into Sunday, we see a potential risk area along the East Coast stretching all the way from Florida up through the mid-Atlantic, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. If this looks like a broad risk area, it is. This is a large storm system. We just looked at that in the Pacific view. This is a potent spring storm, and it has a lot of impacts. There's going to be stronger winds up in the upper Midwest, blowing snow as well. I don't want to discount that. But as we get into the severe impacts, you'll see me focus on those in this video a little bit more closely. Now, before I jump back out west and we kind of track this in the forecast further to the east, we do have this weak system moving through the southeastern U.S. Yesterday, if you remember, we had this hail threat more in the kind of the Arklatex area. Didn't really materialize, but we did see some overnight thunderstorms percolate through Arkansas. And it actually spun up. It's hard to see here, but it spun up what we call one of these mesoscale convective systems, or vortices. MCV is what we commonly call these. These are common in summer, but sometimes you can get them here in spring if there's enough thunderstorm activity. And you can see that spin coming up really nicely here. These actually form similarly to what we call warm core processes that develop tropical storms and hurricanes. Now, albeit this is on a much smaller scale and the impacts are far less, but this is going to be making its way toward the southeast today. And you can actually see that on this HRRR forecast here. If I take this simulated radar out through lunchtime and ultimately 4 p.m. Central, 5 Eastern time, you can see thunderstorms forming out ahead of this MCV here. I actually did research in school talking about how these MCVs can actually produce these little localized tornado threats. So perhaps something to watch here. The Storm Prediction Center has a marginal risk area. They do comment briefly on tornadoes, so likely to be weak in nature, but nonetheless keep an eye here for today in southeastern Alabama with some attached precipitation chances as well in that area. And just for today, you can see that marginal risk here. Now Thursday, this map pretty clear. It's not going to last long, because we just saw Friday, Saturday, and Sunday more of those severe threats. All right, I want to turn my attention. We're going to go through each of these threats here to talk about as we go through the weekend here. The first in the west, we talked about the precipitation, the flood watches, and concerns. If we look closer underneath that cloud shield, the current radar across California, we can see the heaviest rains moving through Southern California here this morning. That intensity of that rain peaking here this morning for Los Angeles, going to be stretching south into San Diego thereafter later this morning. You can see some showers behind it, and then hard to see because they're at upper elevations kind of beyond the radar beam, but heavy snow falling in the Sierra Nevada here this morning. That's going to continue for the next few days at varying intensity. If we jump over and look, you don't need the radar to see this because the Central Sierra Snow Lab by Cal is recording live here. You can actually go to this on YouTube by typing in CSSL live conditions, or if you go Central Sierra Snow Lab, it's certainly going to pop up in the first few hits here. But their live cam here as of this morning, 4 a.m. Pacific time, and it is just dumping snow. On some of these screens here, you can pretty much only see snow with hard to see trees even in the background here, indicative of just how much snowfall they're getting here this morning. Again, 4 to 6 feet of snow. This is about what I'd expect from this view here this morning. If we look at the snow totals from the GFS forecast, we can see that again going off our color bar here in the Sierra Nevada. But later this weekend, some of this activity is shifting north into the Cascades where they need snow as well. You might be eyeing a little bit over here in the upper Midwest as the system wraps up Saturday and then Saturday night, expecting some snow accumulations here along the Red River of the North. The exact nature of these is kind of in question because of how dynamic this system is. Either way, we're expecting a thin strip of blowing snow and accumulations reaching near blizzard-like conditions. Do we get 14 inches in some town in southwest Minnesota? I doubt it, but there is this swath of accumulated snow, and some of this could be a little bit higher, again, in a very localized nature. I'm going to jump over and look at the 3-kilometer NAM forecast here. Let's make it valid as about 6 a.m. this morning. We can see that line of heavier rain along the cold front here. We can see the showers to the north. Taking this forecast forward, so you go through this morning and then into this afternoon, that rain expanding into portions of southern Arizona, snow falling further to the north at the higher elevations. This is good news for portions of the southwest. We've talked about the drought there. That's extending from here all the way over into the southern plains. So this precipitation is needed there, and that snowpack in the lower Colorado River Basin and then the upper Colorado River Basin is welcomed as well. Portions of California will see a lull in activity as we go overnight tonight, but that picks up tomorrow on Friday with more precipitation and snowfall in the mountains as we go through the day. Friday, Southern California seeing more precipitation, comparatively likely to be lighter than what they're currently experiencing, but again, more on the way before kind of transitioning more toward the north as we go into Friday evening, and by that I mean the Cascades in the northwestern U.S. Now, the system's making its way east, and that's when that fire risk is going to develop, but I want to take the forecast here from the 3-kilometer NAM. It is hard to see, but we do have pressure, lines of equal pressure plotted on this map. And if you look, it's kind of hard to see these. They're in gray, but if you look over West Texas and New Mexico, you can see those lines of equal pressure here are getting stacked together very closely between western Kansas, where that low pressure system is developing. And I'll make this color even more obvious. Very packed together here over portions of New Mexico and Texas. And that means that the pressure is changing very quickly from high to low pressure over this area. And that is the pressure gradient force that drives these very strong winds. So it's not a coincidence that those high winds that we're expecting are in this area here over portions of the southern plains with that attendant wildfire risk as well. All right, I'm going to take you through the forecast, the GFS, the maximum wind gust swath. So once it reaches a max, it's going to hang on to those winds to tell us where they are and at what time. Take this through Saturday or Thursday morning, I should say. We're on the 13th. Taking this into this afternoon, we see those winds picking up in portions of the southwest. Overnight tonight, 1 a.m. Friday, see the winds now really picking up in southern New Mexico, far west Texas, now reaching near 60-mile-an-hour wind gusts. But by Friday morning, 6 to 7 a.m. Friday morning around sunrise, that's when we're expecting some of these maximum wind gusts to be occurring in the Texas Panhandle and eastern New Mexico, potentially getting up near 70 miles an hour. I can't rule out some of these wind gusts exceeding that before racing east into the north very quickly. So these wind gusts exceeding 60 mile an hour with very dry conditions, dry soils in some parts of Texas and New Mexico, by lunchtime expanding up into portions of Oklahoma and Kansas. Again, This threat needs to be watched very carefully as we go toward tomorrow morning. I think the timing of it is important as well. Starting the day kind of before you can even get your bearings, as people are waking up with potential wildfire concerns. Needless to say, I'm concerned about this threat. It's something to be watched very closely. As this pushes more toward the afternoon, we're going to see this evolve more so into a severe thunderstorm wind threat as this pushes through portions of the middle Mississippi River Valley. We'll take a look at that in detail in just a second. But just kind of highlight that fire weather risk. I'm showing you the relative humidity forecast for the southern plains. It's going to be dry in this area. We have that overwinter drought that we've been talking about. I'm showing it to you Thursday afternoon now. So we go through the evening, relative humidity higher in the evening, 7 a.m. Friday. You can see how dry it gets over that area where we're expecting those maximum wind gusts. Again, down in toward the single digits of relative humidity through the morning, and then toward lunchtime on Friday. We've highlighted those in yellow here. Anytime you see those, you can imagine just how dry it's going to be with very strong winds and drought conditions. Drought's been developing in, unfortunately, the same area over the last 8 weeks. So plenty of dry fuels and shrubbery here, and too many ingredients of concern coming together not to mention this. If we look at a little bit of a higher resolution forecast on the winds to get us some better timing here. Again, I'll take this towards sunrise on Friday morning. You can see those strong winds potentially exceeding 60 mile an hour, stretching into the panhandle before near lunchtime, pushing through the plains into northern Oklahoma, portions of Kansas, maybe even Missouri, before this transitions more to a severe weather threat. Now, with those strong winds out ahead of the system as it makes its way from the western U.S. to the central U.S., there's going to be this component where the flow is coming up from the Gulf of Mexico. It's coming up from the south quickly as this low pressure system develops off the Colorado Rockies, and that's bringing very warm air up into the central U.S., the Midwest, and the northern plains today. You can see forecasted high temperatures from the National Weather Service pushing up near 80 in the Dakotas, 80 in portions of central and eastern Nebraska and Kansas, Missouri getting in on the 80s as well, portions of the Corn Belt and the central and eastern parts looking at mid-70s today, and that warmth really stretching across portions of the east and southern U.S. as well. Now, as we transition out of that wind threat in Texas and the plains, I want to talk about the severe thunderstorm threat over the Midwest that's likely to develop on Friday. So we're looking at the simulated radar here from a national perspective from the NAM. As you can see, I quickly put this forecast out at 4 p.m. Central Time, Friday the 14th. What we can see here is an arc of thunderstorms developing in western Missouri, far western Iowa. This will be pushing toward the northeast as we go through the day on Friday. Now, 5 p.m., 6 p.m., by 7 p.m. Central, reaching the Mississippi River. But we're not done here. This is going to be a late night threat as this continues to push to Illinois, eastern Iowa. We're now at 9 p.m., 10 p.m., 11 p.m., midnight reaching Chicago and southern Wisconsin, pushing through portions of the middle Mississippi River Valley. Largely more of a kind of embedded, perhaps tornado and wind threat as we get further toward the north, maybe even some hail as well. There is some lingering questions on instability and whether we get discrete supercell development further toward the south. That would potentially bring up the tornado threat as well. Regardless, a dynamic system with very strong winds on the backside of that likely to get embedded in some of these storms here. So you're looking at a wind, sort of a moderate hail threat in this area here as storms transition to a more discrete nature that is kind of further apart from one another, and then this kind of other discrete supercell threat further to the south of that going through Friday evening. If we take a closer look at the Storm Prediction Center and kind of detail their outlook a bit, see greatest severe threat again along the middle Mississippi River Valley, kind of peaking in that dinner time window, but expanding beyond that toward midnight and a swath further to the east of that. The greatest tornado threat extends anywhere from Galesburg down through kind of the middle Mississippi and southern Mississippi River Valley, even into Alabama. There is some question about what kind of development we see further down here. You saw the kind of trailing into those storms ending somewhere down here near Arkansas and Tennessee, but otherwise an expansive threat area. Greater concern for wind is further north, again, where that line's developing in that bowing nature, expecting the stronger winds with a smaller but localized hail concern threat near portions of Missouri and Illinois. Now, one thing we kind of look at are these helicity tracks, and this is just a way to track where some of these convecting allowing models are trying to resolve supercell thunderstorms. Now, these aren't always perfect, but I am kind of reassured to see here that we're not seeing a wide swath of these, at least through Friday, in portions of the middle Mississippi River Valley. So this suggests it's more of a kind of a bowing line segment. That doesn't mean it couldn't produce some of these tornadoes or even some hail, but at least right now not seeing a huge signal for a widespread kind of supercell tornado outbreak. but that doesn't lessen the wind threat in any way for many of these areas. This will transition on Saturday, unfortunately, into more of a tornado threat or outbreak, potentially with some wind as well as we look to the southeast. This has been uptrending, unfortunately, over the last few days on some of the model runs here. The Storm Prediction Center putting out some more serious language for this, talking about the safety risks and the primary risk for tornadoes, and potentially some of those being significant on Saturday for portions of the southeast. We kind of play this ECMWF forecasted precipitation, and we make it valid for Friday evening during that first risk on Friday. You can see this swath of heavier precipitation outlining that risk area here across Illinois, Missouri, with some questions about how far south we get. But as it transitions towards Saturday morning and then Saturday afternoon, see a big uptick in precipitation intensity here, likely indicative of some severe weather potentially forming in the southeast. As we take this towards 7 p.m., you can see that expanding further east and south and overnight into midnight, and then 1 a.m. Central Time, again, lingering here across the southeast, indicative of what's likely to be some severe weather. We talked about it earlier this week, but something we look at is winds just above the surface here to get an idea for wind shear available for tornado-producing storms. I'm going to make this forecast from the ECMWF valid on Friday evening. This is March 14th. You can see those strong winds just off the surface here, but when we looked at that radar presentation, some of the forecast here, we saw that more bowing line segment. Now, again, this is still going to be a risk for these strong wind gusts, potentially embedded tornadoes here. With that bowing line segment, not seeing one of these, likely not to see one of these kind of supercellular tornado outbreaks in this area here. As we get toward the day on Saturday midday and ultimately into the afternoon and evening, you can see stronger winds here, and some of the forecast showing more of a concern for supercell tornadoes in the southeast on Saturday, increasing that risk there. As we take this forecast into Sunday afternoon and evening, you can see that wide swath of precipitation expanding all the way from, again, like I said, northern Florida up through the mid-Atlantic, Virginia into Pennsylvania. I'm going to make this forecast valid in the afternoon, and you can see the storm system pushing east further quickly. So afternoon and early evening, potentially the mid-Atlantic, Carolinas, all the way through southeastern Georgia and portions of South Carolina, looking at an extension of this severe thunderstorm risk as we go through the day Sunday. Storm Prediction Center has put out a risk area there at 15%. Again, for day 4, these are always something to keep an eye on here. So I'm doubtful that we'll see a moderate risk as we go into day 3 tomorrow, but something to keep an eye on even on Sunday before we're rid of this storm system. Now, taking a higher level look at the precipitation, I've made this valid all the way out through Tuesday morning when that storm system is going to be well off our screen. We'll be seeing the next one kind of pushing into this area in the northwest at this time. But just looking at the precipitation swath, you can see more heavy precipitation moving into portions of the southeast and the mid-south. That's expected, again, with that severe weather threat that we just talked about. Precipitation values further to the north, the upper Midwest, because of how quick that storm system is likely to be pushing through in that bowing line segment. Not a lot of chances for sustained precipitation. With the strong winds on the backside of this, unfortunately, this isn't uncommon this time of year, where your evapotranspiration picks up quickly behind some of these systems despite some of the cooler weather, and you quickly evaporate the precipitation that did fall in that top layer of the soil here. Nonetheless, more precipitation falling in the upper Midwest here. Like I said, some snow swath likely to develop in here, but it's going to be localized in portions of Minnesota and the eastern Dakotas. What goes without saying is, unfortunately, this kind of expansive area here along the southern plains and starting to push up into other areas now, showing up in this sort of 4 to 5 day forecasted precipitation. If we look at the snowfall, this pushing all the way out into Thursday of next week, we can see the next week's system starting to show up here in the snow swath. Again, not the clearest picture yet. These details are going to emerge here, but potentially accumulating snow stretching from eastern Colorado through Nebraska, northern Kansas, Iowa, up into Wisconsin, falling next week around midweek. If we take a look at that here, I'll make this forecast valid here. So this morning, we'll watch the system spin up here in Kansas. We'll talk about that snow that's kind of falling in that localized swath here. We talked about the severe weather threat potentially pushing into the Carolinas. That's on Sunday afternoon. But this next system coming onshore in the west now Monday afternoon, now pushing into Tuesday afternoon and evening, and expanding across the Continental Divide before finally Wednesday morning, organizing over portions of Kansas and Nebraska with some accumulating snowfall likely there. Precipitation on this rain snow line extending from Wisconsin down through northwest Missouri. This is Wednesday evening, and then ultimately overnight into very early Thursday morning with more clear accumulating snow potential here in eastern Iowa and Wisconsin before it exits further into the eastern Corn Belt. That snow following along with it. This is now Thursday morning, Thursday afternoon, and evening before exiting the continental U.S. sometime Friday around lunchtime. So that's our next system that we're going to be watching. Again, comparatively weaker than what we're seeing this week, which is good news for folks dealing with all these sorts of hazards that we just talked about. But I will say, if you look closely at this system here on Wednesday, you'll notice an area where we're not seeing decent precipitation again. In fact, if you notice kind of the potential storms or the rain shield really starts to form around Missouri and Arkansas before consolidating further to the east. And that's really leaving the southern plains area dry, potentially allowing that dryness to expand further and further out. And that's the concern going into these summer months here, at least as we get through plant. If we look at the AFS forecast out through 2 weeks, this is a 14-day forecast through March 26th. See the precipitation that we just talked about falling out west. We can see that activity focused in the east. But what was a southern plains dryness concern, you have to start expanding this into the plains, maybe even the western Corn Belt at this point, in through Kansas, pushing up into Nebraska here, at least over the next 14 days. We have to keep our eye on this. If we look at the weeklies out from the ECMWF, this is an extended forecast, takes us from March 20th to April 20th. At least from this forecast model, we're not seeing a lot of relief for the central part of the country. Again, this kind of expansion to the north and to the east here. And the reason we're concerned about it is because of the seasonal models that we've talked about this year have shown the concern for that drought expanding as we get through plant and then into early summer. At least right now, not a great sign that we're seeing this in the short-term forecast confirm what we're worried about in the extended or the seasonal forecast. Now, a component to this I've been keeping an eye on is that subtropical jet stream, which has allowed more precipitation to get into portions of Arizona, Southern California. The flood watches are out there now. The kind of question and what we're hoping for is that would allow some of these systems to develop further west, and we just haven't seen it. We haven't seen those chances materialize. So even though the MJO is again attempting to form one of these cycles or reversions back to phase 7 and phase 8, which could help that subtropical jet pick up in intensity again, it hasn't been delivering a tremendous amount of precipitation to the southern plains, even though it's cranking right now. You can see that flowing south of Hawaii and toward Mexico. So while it's helping to kind of juice the storm system here this week, it hasn't reliably produced much precipitation in the southern U.S., so it doesn't change our concern too much. I will say something to keep an eye on here. If we look in the central Pacific, we're seeing La Nina continue to weaken here across the central and western Pacific along the equator here. It's that black line in the middle of the screen. And further toward the east in the eastern Pacific, we're seeing these warm waters really pick up in a big way. And we actually define different regions of ENSO. So in the middle here, we have your traditional El Nino, what we call 3.4, or El Nino Southern Oscillation. When this is colder than average, that's what we typically call La Nina. But this area here in the eastern Pacific, we call El Nino 1+2. We're actually in an El Nino for that smaller localized area here. And we can actually look at that index here, where we're, by January 30th, earlier this winter, and near La Nina conditions in that easternmost El Nino area. But this year pushing well above, or I should say just in the last few weeks here, pushing above 1 degree Celsius here. So that's going to be something to watch. That can occasionally be a precursor to a proper El Nino event. And if we look at that 3.4 area in the central Pacific, where we kind of define La Nina versus El Nino, again, January 30th, since then, we have been warming the ocean temperatures in the central Pacific tremendously. I doubt that we're going to, but if we were to keep at that same rate, we'd be talking about potential El Nino conditions in the Pacific before summer, let alone the peak of the growing season. Now, again, I doubt that's going to happen. There's going to be a moderation to this. It's going to be peaks and valleys to it. These are hard things to forecast well out beyond a few weeks. But this is something to watch. If this continues to progress this way, at least even at half the rate that it's currently going, we could be looking at an El Nino far sooner than we thought, and that would potentially be a way to get out of some of the drought concerns, at least expanding up into the rest of the central or the Corn Belt or other areas of the upper Midwest this year. Again, for these kind of big droughts to come together, they need a lot of things to work in their favor, and something like this can throw a big wrench into that. Regardless, because of the various agreement and the long-range models and these seasonal models that we look at of potential drought getting through the plant into early summer, forecast I'm showing you now from the National Multi-Model Ensemble, showing that expansion that we're concerned about from the southern plains into portions of the western central Corn Belt, the upper Midwest, where we've talked about the snow drought that's present here in this area, despite some of those snow chances that we just talked about. This remains a concern. It's going to remain a concern until we see that pattern break. There's just no two ways about it. And looking out into that 14-day forecast, the short-term forecast, and seeing a condition that lines up with a seasonal concern is always going to ring a few alarm bells for us. So there's ways out of this drought yet. We have to get through the kind of spring prediction window and plant, but we'll talk about that as we get through it. Eric will be back with you all tomorrow morning. Before I wrap up here, I did want to show you one last slide here. We talked about the ECMWF seasonal forecast. I've made this valid for just the summer months, June, July, August. We talked about this when this came out earlier in March, and we talked about how it shifted drier for portions of the Central Plains, even extending into the Western Corn Belt and Upper Midwest. We just mentioned that agreement, the National Multi-Model Ensemble and the ECMWF seasonal for that drought expansion. But with that El Nino potentially developing a little bit quicker, we're not going to be in it proper anytime soon, but with that warmer water in the Eastern Pacific, that actually tends to be a negative influence for hurricanes in the Atlantic due to wind shear. And that subtropical jet that we just talked about can help induce wind shear of the Atlantic, and hurricanes don't like that. So kind of curiously, looking out mid to late summer here from the ECMWF forecast, you can see this drier swath here stretching from the Caribbean all the way over what we call the main development region of the Atlantic, or the MDR, where we see a lot of these systems first begin to coalesce off the coast of Africa. And this would be pretty bearish on the hurricane season if it verifies, at least in the early part of the season, let alone the late part of the season. So kind of good news here is we might be seeing a less active hurricane season as we get toward late summer and early fall here. A little bit too early to put any sort of pin in that right now, but just something to put on our radar here as some of these seasonal forecasts come into view for the hurricane season later this year. I'll stop it there. Stay safe this week. Eric will be back talking with you all tomorrow.